Hello and welcome to the 42 Rugby Weekly. Gavan Casey here, and I'm joined as always by my esteemed colleague, Murray Kinsella of the 42.ie. Murray, how are you? How's your week been going?
I'm great, Gav. Thanks very much. How's the form there?
Super. I'm down west and life is a lot simpler all of a sudden. Things are going really nicely. Bernard Jackman, delighted to see your face as well. How are you?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Excellent.
Brilliant. Busy week, Mur, with David Nucifora's biannual address, State of the Nation address. Some state the nation is in, by the way. But we'll get into all that a little bit later on and chat about some of the topical stuff happening at the moment as well. I wanted to begin with news that just broke this morning as we record on Thursday of Sean O'Brien's exit from Connacht. He's joining Exeter. It was on the cards for a while, really, Murray, wasn't it? I'm not sure how widely it was reported, to be totally honest. It was one of those where you just kind of catch it through the grapevine and presume it to be fact. And I'm not sure that any Connacht fans are necessarily surprised. We know what kind of player Exeter are getting as well. And it's interesting to hear Rob Baxter pretty much straight off the bat talking about O'Brien being in contention for starts. He sees him as a guy not necessarily for the future or some kind of project, but a guy who can bolster their efforts immediately.
A fantastic move for Sean O'Brien. And this was actually something David Nucifora was asked about yesterday in his State of the Nation address and briefing, and how a player who's shown real ability is leaving the Irish system. So this has obviously been in the works in the background, as you say, for a long time. Connacht obviously had to make their plans for next season. They had to settle on their squad. Obviously, we know that budgets are limited, all the more so now. And they had decided they had enough strength and depth with their centres. And in fairness, there are quite a few centres there. Injuries have opened the door for Sean O'Brien more recently. But that decision was made by Connacht, I suppose, not to contract him prior to that run of form that he's had. And the run of form has been absolutely outstanding. I think he's defended really well. He's looked really energetic, hungry, looked like a guy who's been starved of opportunity and just shown how good a young player can be when they finally get a chance to play games. So in one sense, yeah, Irish rugby is losing a player of high quality. But at the same time, there had to be a decision made there. And in fact, I don't agree with everything David Nucifora said yesterday, but this is the ones where I can kind of see where he's coming from. You know, he was asked, why didn't you put him in a different place in the Irish system? But you look around the provinces and there are quite a few high quality centres. There are quite a few young centres who have shown their own potential over the last couple of seasons even, and short term as well. So sometimes it's very hard to fit every single player in, particularly a guy like this who's had this late spurt in the third year of his academy. He's 23 now, so he's not exactly a kid anymore. But at the same time, a great prospect. And I wouldn't be surprised he goes over there, does really well, and is certainly of interest to the Irish system again in the future. I'm sure he has ambitions of playing for Ireland. Of course, he should. He's a young Irish player with loads of more potential and potentially could return home. So I can understand disappointment at losing him, but I can probably see it from the other point of view as well.
Yeah, Birch, we've called for similar in recent episodes, really, haven't we? Allowing Irish players to find a different pathway, maybe take a detour abroad for a few years, develop that way. We can keep an eye on them, and whether they come back or not, they become better players. The prospect will always be there, of course, for O'Brien to come back. He's from Mullingar, isn't he? So you could see him maybe lining out for Leinster at some point in his career. But your impressions of the move overall?
Look, I think it's brilliant for him. Rob Baxter takes great pride in his ability to find rough diamonds and improve them. And if you look at his recruitment over the last 12 years, he's been an absolute genius at that. And I would say probably, not many other directors of rugby in the Premiership would have made this move, or been able to do it 3 months ago before Sean O'Brien showed in Pro 14 how good he is. I know, while I'm absolutely in favour of young players being able to go abroad and get game time, this isn't the situation that I would be in favour of in terms of just letting the free market control it. So the reason he left was he had no offer from Connacht. And I would say what we've seen of him, what I hear about him, is he probably has the potential to push through in Irish rugby and get lots of game time. And what I would be in favour of is you contract your rough diamonds or your high potential players, and then you work on how you're going to get them game time, but you still keep control of them. And if you look at, probably I wouldn't be letting him go to a club like Exeter because they're so good and they're so good at keeping players happy, and it might be harder to get him back from there. Or he goes on loan to Exeter for a year, but he has a 2-year contract with Connacht or whatever. So it's just a case of you lose control by not actually having that flexibility in the system, or not having any real individualized plan for high potential players, and there's not that plan. We see so many examples of question marks around why players aren't getting game time, why certain players aren't moving, etc. It's one size fits all. It's a very generic model, and the cream will rise to the top, and the cream does normally rise to the top. But there are players out there who maybe need a move into the right environment at the right time to see the potential explode. And even look at Exeter. Tom O'Flaherty was playing in the Welsh club game. It might be that common or might be well known to the listeners, but he was absolutely outstanding against Leinster in a quarter final of the European Cup. He was playing in the club game. No region in Wales picked him up, and he's very much immersed now in the Exeter Chiefs environment. And who knows where he'll end up playing international rugby, whether it be for Wales or England. So in that aspect, in that example, Wales lost control of an asset. Now, they didn't see that asset at the time, and that's fine. We knew Sean O'Brien was a quality player. I think you'd have to hope that the players, the coaches who work with him day in, day out, could see that before we did. And I just think we've let him go. And I don't see. I said I don't have any issue with him going to get game time, but I'd love to see him still contracted and having a control in that, having a close link to him, making sure we know where he's at, and making sure he knows that there's a home for him here, rather than just cut him loose and hope that in 2 years' time he's developed into a top end player and he wants to come home. And that's what happens when you make a decision like this because of market forces, rather than actually, is this the best thing for this player at this time? And I don't think it's for him. It's just a really good example of how we're not really, like Jack Crowley, I said last week, going into the sevens program, for me, it's a load of nonsense. It's not what he needs. He goes back to Munster, he gets on the bench, and comes on last week at fullback. I just think on an individual basis, there's probably only 15 or 16 players who need a little bit of an individual plan and someone who has the kudos to actually make decisions or help make decisions on that. And I think that's missing. And for all the talk about models, the model is just a term that sounds really fancy, but the stuff we see day in, day out isn't, has no individual pathway that I can see being implemented.
Just to reiterate that, I think the key point, for me, that you made loads of good points there, Birch, but it's that contact with him, like keeping him part of the system, even if he's not part of the system. There is an IQ rugby branch now with 3 full-time employees. You have to hope that they're in regular contact now with Sean O'Brien over the next few seasons, keeping him in the loop, keeping him understanding what's going on back at home, where there might be opportunities, where contracts are opening up. And if he's showing that potential to really work hard to get him back here, because they're not going to change their stance on players based abroad. Nucifora kind of reiterated that yesterday. He said, we don't want to weaken the provinces by players going abroad. He said it probably does make sense at the moment for Irish rugby to allow French, English, Japanese clubs to pay their players, but he believes it would weaken the provinces. So for me, like, as I said, I can understand how this has come about, and while he's shown potential in the last few months, like you're saying, Birch, the coaches maybe should have seen that, but it's clear enough that they probably didn't see that when they made a decision. And they saw that they had 5 other centres in Connacht. They looked around Munster, Leinster, everywhere else, Connacht, Ulster. All the provinces have good young players coming through in that position, and they made this decision. But you have to hope that the scope is there for him to be a bit of a Tadhg, to go away, have his own journey, develop in a different way. Like, what an unbelievable place to learn his rugby. It'll improve him as a player, undoubtedly, working under Baxter and his excellent coaching staff. And that there is that possibility and there is that relationship there maintained and even strengthened while he's been away, that if he shows he's top class, he can come back.
Merv, I don't agree with you. I think look, I understand your point, but think about it. What is a player? What matters to a player in terms of making him believe that he's valued by the IRFU? What's the most important thing?
getting a contract. But like,
okay, so right, so that's the starting.
So whose spot does he take, Birch? Like who misses out on game time on a contract, especially now the budgets are even tighter? Like,
yeah, I understand it's a difficult decision to make. Okay, and there has to be fall guys, and there's fall guys in admin jobs. There's fall guys in player contracts. We saw Munster with, quite a few high profile ones. I'm talking about, and I would argue maybe some of the Munster ones. Those players have had a long stint, and we know what they can do. And there was a decision made based upon the realization of their talent. So knowing what their maximum is, I think with Sean O'Brien, there's a gap there. There's a margin for improvement still. Okay, so he could look at every player could become a top class player or become a starter for Ireland, but realistically, there is enough we see in him to think, yeah, he actually has a genuine chance at it. Okay, he actually has a genuine chance of improving. And my argument to you is, and I've been in this situation, and I played in England. Now I went on my own choice, but if you've been let go, and Rob Baxter and Exeter Chiefs in this example show they rate you, okay, by actually putting their money where their mouth is and giving you a contract. A guy turning up in an IRFU tracksuit every now and again to buy you a cup of coffee isn't important. And also, Rob Baxter will want that player to completely focus on what Exeter want. Whereas if the situation is a little bit different, you contract that player, you loan him out to Exeter, well then there's an onus on the club who have, maybe they pay a little bit less, so you share the costs. It's a partnership then, okay? And again, I mean, like, it's a question. The question is around the player. It's not. I don't think every player should be kept. I'm in favor of some players who can't get game time, just cutting loose. And Brian Byrne in Bristol is a great example of someone who's gone over there and just played week in, week out, and must be enjoying it. Looks better. That's not an issue. I'm talking about those. 13 is a hard position to play. Okay, so in Ireland we've lots of depth, but who have we 22 and younger that we can say? How many of those? How many 13s are between the age of 16 and 23 who we can say, right, these guys have the potential to replace Gary Ringrose or Robbie Henshaw or whatever? I don't think there's more than 5. There's more than 5 who've done enough.
Yeah, but like I'm just talking about when they made, and like I'm not trying to talk down Sean O'Brien's player. I think he's excellent. As I said, I think his form's been brilliant. But when they had to make a decision, he hadn't even really played for the senior team, and now he's had a run of 4 games, which is what it is really. And I'm guessing that they didn't feel they could rip up their plan based on that kind of short-term run, I suppose. Like, look at Ulster. James Hume has been brilliant. Like, you don't want to push him out of a place. Stuart Moore has come through. He's been excellent. You've got to keep the likes of Luke Marshall around your squad. In Leinster, they've got Conor O'Brien, his older brother. And Tommy O'Brien and Jimmy O'Brien have shown potential at 13. Like stalwarts like Rory Scannell, Rory O'Loughlin in midfields. They're important players who've shown they can perform at a relatively high level for longer periods over the course of their careers. So I'm just saying I can understand where the squeeze was now, particularly with budgets, with budgets cut. I agree with you totally that you can adapt and shift the model to integrate more players or to find a source to keep players on board, as you say, with a loan system or with a genuine link to another club based abroad. So yeah, I can agree with you on that front.
No. Look, I'm not blaming Connacht on this because I presume that they knew this guy had talent, right? Because it's very rare a guy trains really badly. You don't see any glimpses of it, and then they come in and play and look so comfortable. That doesn't happen very often, right? And also, let's be honest, he hasn't landed from Mars. He's been in our system. He's played under 20s. He's played for Clontarf. He's been around, right? So we have a talent ID department who apparently have data, information, footage on all these players. So, like, my point is, when Connacht give that list back to David Nucifora or whatever and say, these are the guys we're contracting or we want to contract, these are the guys we let go, is there no red flags? Is there no stars after certain players? Because I think in this situation here, if you're focused on keeping the best players in Ireland, which we're told that is the focus because you can't play outside, and the best place to be for every player is to be in Ireland, well then you have these players earmarked and you ask Connacht back, well, why are you letting go of Sean O'Brien? Because all our talent ID models and data tell us he is number 6 in the depth chart, or he's one of the top young underage 13s coming through. Can we be flexible here? Can you find the money somewhere else? Because let's be honest, it wouldn't be a huge amount of money. Can we find the money somewhere else? Is there another player you can let go who maybe has reached the maximum? Do you need that seventh lock? Or can we front load some of the money we're going to give you in 2 years' time so we can keep him? That's the stuff that has to happen, Murray, in my opinion. Like, it doesn't make sense to me that we can't. Like, I love the fact that Munster and Nucifora were able to find the money to get Zebo. Okay, I love that. That's shown. Okay, maybe he won't get back in the Irish team. Maybe he will, but it's helping Munster be stronger, right? And that's what the IRFU should be doing, helping the provinces be stronger. And I just think in this situation here, for the amount of money that was involved, and like if we knew he was good, why wasn't there some way of trying to find a way of keeping him in our system? And even let have Connacht have an extra centre on the roster for a year that Bundy Aki is going on the Lions tour. We know players tend to miss a little bit more the year after. Like, there's lots of little things that you can sit down and talk about. And again, like, it's just my opinion on it, but I don't see how, with such a small player base, 4 teams, everyone aligned, we all know everything, we've got data coming out of our ass, and we can't actually go, right, there's a player here about to leave, can we actually think about something that we could do? Like, it does. Like, what chances does Sean O'Brien, who's a late developer, what chances does Sean O'Brien who can't get to England? You know, they have no chance. They're gone because the club game has been written off. Unless he's a 7 specialist, he's finished, and they're out there. The Tom O'Flaherty's are in our game. They're in Ireland. They're in Ireland in the club game, but there's no way for them.
I suppose I don't want to sound like I'm sticking up for IFU here, but I do want to, like, there's only 4 provinces. There's only a limited number of spots. I mean, there's so many players who've missed out who've been probably as talented or nearly as talented as Sean O'Brien is, some more who can't get through. And that's a strength of the system as well, that the squeeze is so tight. I mean, yeah, you could absolutely make an exception for Sean O'Brien, but why not make an exception for loads of other 23-year-old guys who've played a handful of times for the province and just haven't quite pushed through while they're in the academy? Like, it didn't happen for him because there was other good centres there. Connacht at the moment can't even afford another loose head prop at the moment. They're going into next season with 7, maybe down to 6 now with Dennis Buckley injured. So, yeah, it might only be a small amount here and there, but I think you have to make hard decisions at times, and this is one of them. And it was probably brutal on Sean O'Brien, but he's landed on his feet, which is the best thing. He's got a great move. I'd be hopeful of seeing him back.
Yeah, just to reiterate, absolutely, you have to make hard decisions. It's probably the most ruthless, profession you can have. But if you're in a system where it's not about today that matters, and there's a long-term plan, and it's Team Ireland, and everything goes towards the national team, I don't see the logic in letting somebody who's already shown. I don't agree with you that he hasn't shown.
When they made the decision, he hadn't really played. Like he, and again, I'm not trying to criticize him, but he hadn't really played for the senior team when they made the call. Like, and it highlights a weakness that players don't get a chance to show how good they are, and then the decision is made, and then he gets a chance with injuries opening up, and he gets a chance to show. Like, it must be hard. I don't know, as a coach, as someone in those decision making places, to make a really rounded decision without seeing them play, and that was probably the case here.
Yeah, gents, we're going to have to call it a draw. I know listeners at home do not want.
I accept defeat.
Not that that's what it's about. It's really interesting to get a different viewpoint, and absolutely, I accept all your points. I think they're all really valid. I suppose I see it slightly.
Yeah, just the last point on it. I don't think every player who plays 5 games for the province should be kept. That's completely not my point. My point is that if there's financial decisions to be made, and in COVID there has to be financial decisions, I would look at can we not recontract a guy who's reached the top of his potential, who's maybe a squad player, and keep the player who in 2 years' time maybe is a match winner first. That's all.
But if you were the head coach, would you not want the proven squad player? You know,
yeah, if
your job is on the line in terms of winning matches and losing matches.
Absolutely, but Ireland isn't run like as probably cutthroat as the top 14 or France. And this is where you go to the union and you explain, or hopefully they already know. If things are right, they already know. In New Zealand rugby, they would find a way of being flexible and keeping their best talent. That's my point.
Yeah, I know listeners didn't want to hear me interject there, but we do have to move on. We've other things to chat about. Some of it tangentially related to what we're talking about now, and we have a bit of a deadline or a time limit as well. Murray, Kieran Pearson had a question which is related to this, and he was wondering, with Connacht confirming the signing of Leva Fafita, are there any rumours or negotiations around the other provinces of more players coming during the off-season that you know of? Any particular names popping up or positions that provinces are eager to get more depth in?
Well, according to all the head coaches, they're finished. And Andy Friend said that the other day. He did kind of have the qualifier of that loose head prop slot. I mean, Dennis Buckley was getting his scans this week. Obviously, they had their fingers crossed, but it looked pretty bad. Everyone could see that. And even by his own post, I think on Instagram, kind of confirms as much. So he could be missing into the start of next season. And as I said, that leaves them down to 6 props, which is a really low number as you get going in a new campaign. So I'd imagine they'll be going and asking, as Bernard said there, about maybe increasing the budget slightly to get someone in. Otherwise, I think they're all pretty set. As we said, like, budgets have been rolled back. Players have accepted reduced salaries, shorter contracts. So there's not a whole lot of wiggle room there. I would have loved to have seen Leinster go out. I think Birch has mentioned this before, and sign a really big, powerful, probably in the second row. But I haven't heard any names on that front, and actually haven't heard much else. If I had, you'd be reading it on the 42.
Or hearing it on this podcast, Bert. You've broken plenty of transfer stories here in the past, some of which don't seem to get picked up to the extent that maybe they should.
Yeah, no, I think I'd say we're done, bar, as Murray said, a late injury, a Dennis Buckley dispensation to they need another prop anyway. Connacht did so with Paddy McAllister leaving. So I think it's done unless Leinster get some money somewhere to bring in. Leinster have the non-Irish qualified spots. Obviously they need to get it pushed through with the RFU, but I think it's done. I think it's it. It's going to be very low excitement value. We got our news early with the likes of Jenkins and Nakawara, but yeah, I don't think there's a huge amount happening.
George, you mentioned earlier on, we were chatting, maybe James Cronin would make sense to Connacht. Like, that would.
Well, I didn't agree with James Cronin not staying in Munster. I thought Munster needed more front rows rather than less. But that decision's being made now. And yeah, James Cronin, like, if you look at Connacht, they would have lost to Munster only for Andy Friend took off his starting props in the 38th minute and brought on Beelum and Buckley. And against Treviso, with Buckley going off after 40 seconds, that was effectively the match. I mean, Treviso just took the game by the scrum. And I would worry for Connacht next year if Buckley's injury is as bad as it looked, and if they don't get inadequate replacements. And again, if James Cronin, wouldn't it be great to keep him in the system? And I know it's expense and all that, but him going away, James Cronin isn't a million miles away from being an international or being a starter for Ireland. If we had a few injuries, obviously with Cian Healy, being a little bit older, we're not sure how long he's going to play on for. I think Cronin in the Irish system would be great, but and it would help Connacht. And again, that's the kind of thing, we all say, the RFU have to give the provinces foreign players. Yeah, I think that's an added extra, and it can make a huge difference. But what about actually giving them the Irish qualified players, the guys who are already internationals, to help them? And yeah, it's I think James Cronin to Connacht would be a great boost for Connacht, and him and Buckley. You have two really experienced, proven loose heads, and I love Wycherley and Liam O'Connor's potentially in Munster, but I just think if you want to be winning the European Cup, which Munster do and should be thereabouts, if you have Kilcoyne, Cronin, Wycherley, O'Connor, that's not an area of weakness. It's not an area of weakness. You could argue the hooker. I would argue the hooker and tight head, you need more depth there, but they're not going to get that now, and haven't done a great job of bringing through Knox or Salanoa enough this year to know how good they can be, but that's their own choice. So for me, Cronin to Connacht would be a smart move for everybody.
One last question on Connacht. This one also came from Kieran. And he was saying, with Andy Friend's comments about whether Abraham Papali'i will still be playing rugby union if he can't get his tackle technique sorted, is that very harsh for a coach to be saying publicly, specifically how he phrased it? Obviously, they've put work into improving Papali'i and more needs to be done, but I can't imagine this will help a player's confidence or motivate them to do better if your coach is publicly questioning whether you're up to the task, especially as he recently agreed a new one-year deal. Should Friend have approached what he said differently? Sticking with yourself there, Brett, you know the language of coaching. What did you make of that?
Yeah, look, at every time a coach speaks, it's framed, and unless they've completely lost the head, there's a method behind it, and Andy Friend is very capable of getting those messages across and framing his responses. I think there's no secret that they've worked really hard with Papali'i in terms of his technique, and they've been soft and they've been understanding, and they've done the tackle tech, and they've spoken to him, and they've lost out because he's been banned. And eventually you have to just, call it. Because other players, it's not just him, it's the rest of the team who have to finish a game with 14 and have to, play without him. So I think this isn't throwing the player under the bus. This is probably just his frustration and wanting Abraham and everyone involved with Abraham to know that this can't continue. So I think it's fair.
Murray?
Yeah, well, it was definitely pointed. It was something that he had kind of brushed away immediately after the match, but clearly had thought about it and wanted to get a strong message across, which you would imagine has been privately reiterated as well, because 3 red cards in his first season is just astronomical, isn't it? And now the impression is in people's heads, and you heard Jared Butler even say that during the game, it's just because he's a big guy he's getting noticed, but unfortunately it's because he's hitting people in the head. Certainly in 2 of the cases they've been really bad ones. Connacht felt the one against Zebra was harsh, where there was a late change of direction from the ball carrier. But I mean, the last one was a 5-week ban. We haven't heard yet what this ban is going to be, but you would imagine they'll be extremely harsh with it, given the really recent, I suppose, track record. And he'll miss games in the start of next season. And he's a guy who we've seen when he's on the pitch, he's unbelievably impactful and explosive, and look like being really important going forward into next season. So it's massively frustrating for them. And as I said on the podcast on Monday for members, he has a massive responsibility to get it right. Even with this example against Benetton, he's absolutely trying to make an impact. I totally understand that. That's his job. But he's got massive scope there to go even slightly lower and still be quite dominant with it, I think. So yeah, that work they're doing, the time and effort they've put into him as a project, having kind of brought him out of the blue, I suppose, in terms of a signing that we never really expected or anticipated. They want to see some payback for that, which they've got in terms of his performances when he's been on the pitch, as I say. But I can totally understand the stronger message, and I think it'll probably get a response. It's an eye-opener for Papali'i.
As Murray mentioned there, Rugby Weekly Extra on Mondays, he delved into Munster's victory and Connacht's defeat with Owen Toole, members.the42.ie, and be sure to check out GAA Weekly as well, with Maurice Brosnan, Fintan O'Toole and Kerry legend Mark O'Shea. Okay, Murray, the biannual briefing. Did you leave it with more questions or more answers this time around?
Always more questions, I suppose. When you're in the briefings, in fairness to Nucifora, he's very good at fielding a question, washing it around for a couple of minutes, and you're kind of tracking along, and then you realise after the fact when you're transcribing it that he never really said anything or gave you the detail you were looking for. So loads of positive messages about club rugby being important, about the RFU are working away in the background to see what that interface between club and pro game will look like without any detail there. Spoke about IQ Rugby. We're going to see loads of different players from even outside the UK coming in through that system, without mentioning names or anything like that. And I suppose highlighting that he'd recontracted all the players that Irish Rugby wanted to recontract heading into next season. And generally he feels that things are in reasonable health. He batted away a question about the RFU missing out on several of the targets in their own strategic plan. He's kind of just said, listen, that's something we write down, and sport can change things very quickly. He thinks there'll be an upswing in form and in results. And yeah, he thinks things are in pretty good nick. Interestingly enough, he was kind of non-committal on his own future. Contract's up in 2022, the summer of. And he spoke about obviously the personal difficulties of COVID-19, the pandemic and family. He's obviously Australian, and that is a tricky part of it. But he said there's plenty that they had hoped to do in the last 15 months that they couldn't get done. And kind of left it at that. Didn't say, yeah, I definitely want to stay here. So that'll be a fascinating part of it to see as well. So yeah, I think more questions than answers, as usually tends to be the case.
You got an email from Aina Hegarty. He said, "Hi Murray, question for the pod. The IRFU are completely neglecting the AIL as a player pathway to professional rugby, but state that there is a small player base and they set up the IQ system. Why is there not a club interpro series or even organised games between the province A teams against a club provincial side, so like Munster A versus Munster clubs, to see if any players stand out at that level? Or an underdog programme like the GA did years ago, in which professional contracts are available, sevens or provincial, something for which the AIL players can aim." Bernard, I'll throw that to yourself because you touched upon it just before we were fielding Kieran Pearson's questions a moment ago about the AIL. We have also discussed this in the past, but I guess it's worth bringing back up in light of Nucifora's comments.
Yeah, I think this is one where sometimes people go, "Oh, lack of resource," etc. The best resource we have is actually in Ireland in terms of all the clubs and schools and population. And if you look at how much money and time and how big a part of the program it seems the high performance pathway, the NIQ model is, and the sevens model is, which in reality, it'd be a small amount of players who are ever going to come through that. And I think we've got it all wrong. It'd be like, the reason Dublin are successful in GA is obviously they have the structures right with population. The reason Leinster are successful is the structures and population. And for us as Irish rugby, as a team and as provinces, the numbers are in Ireland. The numbers are in Ireland in the game spread across the whole country. That's where you have the best bang for your buck. And we spoke last week about, non-traditional areas, West Dublin, Tallaght, etc. Like, it's madness. I mean, we've 3 people full-time in England, in the UK, looking for our Irish qualified talent. And where is the actual benefits of that in terms of the amount of investment in it? And also at neglect, I think if you had a domestic game that was completely aligned, motivated, etc., that's the icing on the cake. The sevens is the icing on the cake. But it's like for us, that's the only thing that really matters. And actually what we've done and the areas that we haven't tapped into, that there is a lot of potential players, supporters, Alacadoos, etc., just marginalise them. It makes no sense to me. It absolutely, and I know this. I know this is Welsh, so I'll give you the background to this. So when the WRU bought the Dragons, there was a frustration internally in the WRU that there wasn't enough being done by the 4 regions to recruit from the Exiles program. Okay, so they had a guy whose job was to develop depth charts and Excel sheets with contacts of these kids playing in England who are Welsh qualified, right? And there was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, and they had a list down to 12-year-olds, etc. And it looked really impressive, a PowerPoint presentation with hundreds of names, different positions, go take your pick, right? But when we actually, the pressure was on me then because the WRU bought the Dragons. The Dragons is the nearest region to England. The Dragons had probably the poorest talent pool because obviously years of underspending, we hadn't been able to keep our players. The academy had been closed down, etc. So we actually did need players. So the pressure was on me to go and bring back all these Exiles. It was like a pot of gold. Soul is a pot of gold. But when you go out there, there's only a couple who actually are good enough. You know what I mean? And because obviously it's a far smaller number than are playing in Wales, or a far smaller number that are playing in the Bectivs, in the Ballina colleagues, etc. in Ireland. There's just more bodies, so obviously there's going to be more chance of more talent here. And again, for sure, there's talent that can come back. In Wales, in fairness, Ross Moriarty, steeped in Welsh rugby history from his father and his uncle, went to Gloucester, played for England under-20s. I'm not sure whether he won a World Cup or played in a World Cup final for England under-20s. But Wales knew that he was good enough to play for Wales. So they, and I was part of bringing him back to Wales. So you don't lose out on many players by not having 3 full-time guys over there, because the cream will rise to the top. And when they become 19 or 20, their agents know if they're Welsh qualified, Irish qualified, Scottish qualified, etc. So you find out about them. You actually find out about them anyway. And then it's up to, if Munster want to sign a Mike Cayley, or Ulster want to sign a Will Addison, then they go and sign him. But they sign him based upon, okay, they take into account he's Irish qualified, that's a help. But they actually judge him against, what's in Munster, Darren Sweetman or whatever, and you're judging like for like. Whereas this whole thing about there's hundreds of kids in England who are Irish qualified, yeah, there is, and that's great. But you'll find that they'll naturally go through the pathway anyway. And it's not necessarily the IRFU who are helping them all the way through. So, and the problem then as well is because of pressure, because for me anyway, because the WRU were so into this idea that the regions should be bringing these guys back, there's pressure then to give them a contract, right? And then if you do give them a contract and they're actually not as good as the domestic guys, well, then you're behind. So I just think that I'd love them to actually switch focus and go, right, all the money you're putting into sevens, some of the money you're putting into sevens, some of the money you're putting into Irish qualified players abroad, or not even money, time, and actual make a plan. Let's communicate with every club in Ireland, right? Let's communicate with every school in Ireland. Let's look at areas that we don't actually have any footprint, and let's give that a bash for 3 or 4 years, right? And let's go hard at that. And I'd be shocked if we actually hadn't got more players coming through from that anyway. And Irish rugby was in a much better place with a stronger connection between the top and the bottom. I just think it's lovely, but it's icing on the cake. It shouldn't be the fundamental. And some of the comments you hear about the propaganda about the sevens, Will Connors played sevens. Yeah, he did, but that didn't make Will Connors the player he is. The 6 years in Clongowes, playing rugby every day, playing 15s every day, going into the sub-academy, going into the academy, that's what made him. And while it's nice for them to play a little bit of sevens, the only way for me that sevens is a viable option in terms of the 15s game, it could be its own game within a game, is if they're getting players and athletes who aren't in a traditional pathway and they're so good at sevens and they become so skilled in rugby that they can become viable options for the national game. If not, it's a separate game. So, yeah, I think, I was interested when Murray said, David's very good at taking a question and washing it around and giving the answer. And at first, that's his job. His job is to praise everything they do. And I suppose as pundits, our job is to actually question, is that a good strategy? And does it really make sense? And the whole idea about, you have to put something on paper in terms of strategic plans. I mean, my job is I sell market data to financial services, so maybe I'm biased. I'm also a salesperson. So every week I have to sit down with my boss and say, by the end of the week, I'm going to bring in X. Okay. And I have to commit to that. And obviously sometimes I miss, right? But I'm not just giving them a number off the top of my head and hoping it comes off. I have to be held to account. And if I miss consistently, I'll be put on a performance plan. And if I continue to miss, I'll be let go. And likewise, when financial institutions publish their annual accounts and the CEO speaks, the market moves. The market moves based on results because that's what people want. Did they say they were going to turn over X amount? Did they turn over X amount? Did it cost cut to this amount, etc.? So for me, I just think it's amazing that we have a strategic plan that's apparently driving our strategy, but actually the measurables don't really matter. Only if you hit them, they're brilliant. And if we don't hit them, sure, you have to write down something. It was mind-boggling. It was the most shocking thing for me from yesterday was that the things that we've all been saying, that's what we're chasing, that's what we're working towards. Semi-final of the World Cup, the other KPIs across women's and national game, that they actually don't really, it was just put down on paper, it doesn't matter.
Well, that leads us on to Caelan's question, which was, Murray, on yesterday's National Field Day, that is the David Nucifora briefing day, should the Irish fans start to rethink expectations and opinions surrounding the game in Ireland? All throughout the silly season of contract talks, there was a lot of, why did player X get a contract when my guy, player Y, didn't, so on and so forth. Add to that the inconsistent narratives and viewpoints about signings and departures, and recent views that Ireland's 3 successive third-place Six Nations finishes are gigantic failures at boardroom level more than on the field. Should we as a fan base dial back our harshness when in reality our provinces are still relatively successful? The national side are, on paper, probably the third best team in Europe, and maybe, just maybe, revisit the fact that the Joe Schmidt days were a peak time, and coming short of this success is not a failure. Niall echoed a lot of that. I won't read out Niall's message in full just because we need to get a move on here, but it's sad really to hear Caelan go down this route. A passionate rugby fan, a knowledgeable rugby fan such as himself, for his expectations to have been diluted to this point where he's settling for being the third best team in Europe, where there are really only 6 teams, actually probably 5.
That's a very realistic viewpoint on things, and absolutely valid. And like, the Joe Schmidt era was probably an overachievement, but it shows what can be achieved with a really cohesive, unified, strategic approach that Joe Schmidt brought. And in fairness, he carried a whole lot of it. It wasn't just with the Ireland team. He had his tentacles were everywhere in Irish rugby, and he was a massive influence. And I suppose you can credit a lot of that success to him, not just the system. I think Irish rugby should be aiming high. Absolutely. Like, we've got this model that everyone talks about as being brilliant. David Nucifora flags all the time. We've got this great model, central contracts, keeping players in Ireland, not playing abroad. Like, what's the purpose of it if you're not going to aim high and try to achieve Six Nations titles? There aren't that many competitors in World Rugby. Like, it's bizarre that Irish rugby hasn't been in a semi-final of a World Cup when there's so few teams who are in any way competitive. Like, I think it's been underachievement when you look at a longer time period. Absolutely, our population is small, but I think it should be ambitious in what it's trying to achieve. And the worrying thing at the moment is that it looks to be going on a backwards scale, like not just leveling off, but actually slightly declining. As I said, Nucifora thinks there'll be an upswing. He thinks it's very close, but I think there are a couple of worrying signs there, as we've discussed across the board. And that's just not a national level. That's in the game, the club game, the disenfranchised people there. And as Bernard mentions, all those things like IQ Rugby and Sevens, they probably drive an even bigger wedge. Even over in the UK, like there's a volunteer network over there called the IRFU Exiles that have been doing amazing work for decades and decades, and seems to have just been vanished from the face of the earth. Those people are still there trying to spot Irish kids and doing a great job at that. And many of the players who come and play underage rugby still with Ireland are from people like that, spotting them on the ground. And the Sevens thing is, it is tricky for someone who's looking at the vast promotion of that, even through the IRFU's own social media networks and website, and thinking, the club game could do with that kind of boost and that kind of praise, I suppose, from David Nucifora. So, there's all sorts of worrying signs there, I think. But I don't think Irish rugby should just settle for being middle of the road. That's just not an ambitious organisation, an ambitious way to do things. They should be aiming high, and Joe Schmidt and his team showed that it can be achieved.
To be fair, so did Declan Kidney and his team, and so did Eddie O'Sullivan and his team. Bernard, it's not just I understand completely Caelan's point about Schmidt, and there is, I think, an argument to be made that Ireland overachieved towards the end of his reign, but we were aiming higher than third in Europe for the previous decade as well.
Yeah, we were, but I think that we're only getting to see now the results of probably trying to just completely focus on the only jersey that matters is green jersey, and trying to dilute the identity of each province and having the provinces having more autonomy over what they do. I think what I'm sensing is a push to centralise everything. Right, the more and this is being slowly happening, more control for the IRFU, the provinces having less say in how things are run, and I think that's a disaster for us, because I don't know if I think the people who have the most passion and the most risk or risk and reward is the people closest to having skin in the game, and they're the people who at provincial level. So I think everything being ran out of HQ, everything ran by a model is not helping us, and we're getting further away from where we are. And I think, like 2018, there was still strong rivalry in Irish provincial rugby, and I think since then by moving players around and not having actually focused on what Munster can produce, what Connacht can produce, what Ulster can produce, and then fill in the gaps. But I just think that everything is now, RFU control everything. We're told the RFU control the hiring of a CEO for the provinces. That's too much for me. That's completely. How much does one person know about every single aspect of running businesses, running provinces? It's for me, Munster should have autonomy and be competing, fighting tooth and nail with the other four provinces or the other three provinces. And I think that the more become, and that's across everything. That's across young players, other players. That's across their domestic game, how they produce players. They should be creating the best possible pathway for Munster, because rugby's not new in Munster. Rugby's been in Munster for as long as it's been, and very close as long as it's been in Leinster or other parts of the world. Connacht as well. Connacht have to have their own bespoke model in terms of how they're going to do things. But if everything is coming down via some model sent from the RFU, I also think the best people are in the provinces rather than necessarily in HQ. That's just the nature of it. The best people tend to want to work at the performance end of it. And the performance end of it, unless you're coaching the national team in Ireland, is Leinster, Munster, Ulster and Connacht. Chance to win a European Cup or a Pro 14. So I fear that the centralised model has been pushed too far. And I think if you let the provinces create their own way of doing things, obviously there's the players are contracted with RFU, so there has to be boundaries. But I think we're getting further away from success. And it's nonsense to say that third is where we should be. We should always be looking to be winning it every so often and in the top two. Because Wales is the perfect example. What Wales are doing without half the money we have and a smaller population. Okay, people say it's a national game, but you go and see how many kids are playing soccer in Cardiff and Swansea now. Wales have overachieved, and that's great. They see that as being testament to them. I would say we underachieve, and that can't be allowed to happen. And it's not just, it's across talent ID, it's across referees, it's across coaching. Every single area are underperforming, in my opinion. And if you're underperforming in all areas, you're going to just get mediocrity.
Well, there is a kind of a mastermind complex at HQ, Bernard, and you and I and Murray have probably alluded to it in the past, or at least I remember saying to you guys, we're bad at sports governance in this country, not just in rugby. It's a problem across a number of sports and has been for decades. We're actually bad at governance, I think. As soon as a guy is wearing a suit for too long in Ireland, he becomes a problem down the line. And when you have a very small number of people pulling all of the strings and in control of everything, it's only natural that groupthink sets in. And when we do this podcast and when you guys raise issues that you believe exist in Irish rugby, there's often feedback going, no, you're wrong. This is where we're doing everything so brilliantly. And I genuinely think there are delusions in the RFU that everything is going swimmingly because they're not open to any sort of an outside challenge. And eventually this kind of consensus forms that everything is rosy in the garden, when if you open your eyes or smell the roses, they're not particularly nice. Looking at Six Nations tables, looking at, say, the provinces in Europe over the last couple of years. So, how does that change, or can it be changed?
Just one of the worrying things on that, is that now the financial situation isn't great. They lost 35 million last year, 30 million this year. Again, Nucifora hammer that home, need to get crowds back in, and saying that, listen, we weren't able to do the stuff we wanted to do in a whole lot of development areas because of the pandemic. And it's it's obviously a valid reason, but it's also, you would hope, not going to be an excuse moving forward not to try and push these things on. An organisation like the RFU has to have ambitious objectives that aren't, as Bernard says, just related to the Ireland team. Having a really vibrant, connected, aligned to the pro game AIL, it should be as just high a target for them. That's not the case at the moment. Speak to anyone in the club game and they're worried about the direction that's moving in as well. So it shouldn't just be about those headline targets as well. You look at that strategic plan and the All-Ireland League, it basically isn't mentioned in there. There's pages and pages of bullshit in there And the All-Ireland League, I think, is in fine print, in the kind of terms and conditions at the bottom or whatever it is. It's not really part of the strategy. So that kind of stuff is as important in terms of objectives, and that all contributes towards a healthier end product at the very top.
Just on that, money, obviously, that's going to be excuse. Honestly, the domestic game, if you do it properly, the volunteers will actually do 90% of the work. You get actually a competition structure that motivates them, that attracts them. They will run with that, and they've done it for years. It's actually, the problem is now that they don't actually, and the fact that it's barely mentioned in the strategic plan, isn't a great sign, or it is. It's kind of proves where we feel it's at. So yeah, I think that the money issue is not the problem. It's actually connecting and creating a vibrant domestic game is what's needed.
Because one of the other interesting things that Nucifora did admit yesterday was that Irish rugby, I mean, no breaking news headlines here, is too reliant on the school system. He said, yeah, it is. And he spoke about, listen, we've been looking at ways to get into non-traditional areas of the country. But as we've discussed in depth probably in this pod, where is that? Like, what are we missing? What have we not seen? If it was really the case that we plaster all over their website every single week and we would be in our faces. So we're not really seeing that. And that is a big issue again for Irish rugby. Like, it's handy to rest on the laurels and take in the top school boys every year. It's a brilliant system. I would never knock anyone involved in that. I think it's doing unbelievable work in Irish rugby. But you've got to look beyond that, and you've got to have different strands and build different ways of getting players through, and just having people in the game playing rugby that aren't even going to be pros at all, because that's part of a healthy sport as well. Yeah,
just Murray, absolutely, I don't disagree with that at all. But the schools are doing the work for themselves as well. I mean, not very much. The RFU haven't gone into all the schools and said this is what you need to do. They've been doing this for donkey's years, right? And they're producing players because that's what they do. It's a sport they play in their school, and there's a very good competition in Munster, Leinster, and Ulster that has kudos for those players and parents and past pupils, etc. So the competition is looked after that. So absolutely, yeah, we are very reliant on it, but we actually, the people who are saying they're too reliant on it haven't actually really built it. Okay, so what have they built? Like, I mean, it's not as if they've been so focused on the schools game for the last 20 years, and now they've said, shit, we're too reliant on that. They actually haven't done that. So what have they done? What have they actually done in the meantime? Like, I'm telling you, I'm coaching my old school, and Leinster, Leinster help out a little, etc. I've no complaint against Leinster in that. But the reality is, it's the carrot of the players wanting to play for their school in a competition in third year and in sixth year, that means a lot to them. And they have consistent fixtures in first year, second year, fourth year, fifth year, where they play the same guys every Saturday, the same schools, etc. So the competition looks after their development. And you can argue that they're not coming out skillful enough or athletic enough or whatever. But like, they're doing their job to a certain extent. They are producing players, and those players are getting to play for Leinster and Ireland and Munster, etc. So what have you done in the meantime to actually create the people who don't come from schools? Like, that's the argument, you know what I mean? And like, it's now 2021. I mean, this isn't rocket science. If David Nucifora took over in 1991, he could have said the same thing, we're too reliant on schools. So this shouldn't be a surprise.
Murray, in a paragraph, the games this weekend, Connacht hosting the Ospreys, Leinster away to Glasgow, and Ulster are away to Edinburgh. The first two games are tomorrow, Ulster away to Edinburgh on Saturday. Give me your predictions, thoughts?
Leinster to win, they're still in the hunt. Connacht are playing an Ospreys team who are in the hunt, and their season is ending on this kind of damp squib, as are Ulster, who are the bare bones of their squad. They've COVID cases, people in isolation, close contacts, and a couple of injuries as well. So a tough one for them away from home. But it'd be nice to see the Connacht and Ulster squads finish on a bit of a high after disappointing final few months of the season before they switch attention to getting better next year.
Murray, thanks a mil, as always.
Cheers. Enjoyed it.
Bernard, thank you.
Thank you.
Catch you soon. Thanks to everybody at home for all of your listenership. questions. Thanks to all the 42 members in the WhatsApp group and beyond. Members.the42.ie if you want to join them in there. Support our independent sports journalism. Enjoy the rugby over the weekend. We will be back on Monday with Murray and Owen. I'm back next Thursday otherwise. Till then, take it easy.